The air was thick with the scent of dry earth and diesel. Somewhere in the distance, a hyena called out into the silence, its cry swallowed by the vast emptiness of the Sahel night. In the capital, laughter still clung to the air. Young boys played football barefoot in the streets, mothers boiled rice over open fires, lovers whispered promises beneath rusted balconies. But in Traore's heart there was a storm gathering. He sat alone in the barracks courtyard, eyes locked on the horizon. There was no moon tonight, just a vast black sky with scattered stars that blinked like warnings from another world. His fingers traced the handle of his pistol, not out of fear, but ritual. Every soldier has a moment before a mission where he faces not the enemy, but himself. This was his. He had received the call just before sunset. A whisper from intelligence. A group of school children and 2 foreign aid workers had been taken from a remote village near the Niger border. No demands, no trail. Just a haunting video. Clip sent anonymously, a trembling camera, terrified faces, rifles in the background, and a voice that said only, "You will never find them." Most would call it impossible. The area was lawless, swarming with mercenaries and remnants of militant groups that had long slipped through the cracks of forgotten wars. But Traore didn't believe in impossible. He believed in responsibility. That night, as the rest of the world slept, he made a decision that wasn't his to make. He would go. There was no order, no political approval, no press conference. Just the quiet resolve of a man who had grown up watching his people disappear without answers. A man whose childhood was painted with the cries of mothers and the silence of graves with no names. He remembered his mother's voice that night, clearer than ever. She used to hum while washing clothes in the river. A soft tune with no words, just melody. It stayed with him like a ghost, comforting and painful. She had died in a raid when he was 8. Rebels had come in trucks, screaming commands in a language foreign to their village. He watched them drag his father into the dirt. Watched his mother stand in front of the children with nothing but her bare hands. She was gone before he could run to her. Traore never forgot that sound, the gunshot that silenced her. He had lived with it like a splinter in his soul, and every decision since had been a quiet rebellion against that memory. He wasn't just a soldier, he was a promise. A broken boy who vowed no other child would feel what he felt that night. Before leaving, he went to the small chapel behind the training grounds. He didn't pray, he hadn't done that in years. Instead, he knelt and placed a photo on the altar. It was creased and sun-worn. A picture of 3 girls holding hands. In front of a school, one of them had been kidnapped. Her name was Esada, 10 years old. She loved sunflowers. Her father had once served under Traore during a failed mission in the north. He had died protecting a supply route, his last words a plea to watch over the children. Traore stood, slowly took a breath that shook his chest, and walked into the darkness. The city faded behind him. The road ahead was nothing but dust and danger. He had no backup, no satellite support. Just a rusted truck, a battered map, and a mission that no one else dared to claim. He knew what failure meant. It meant mutilated. Bodies returned in silence. It meant mothers collapsing at doorways, fathers howling into the ground. He had seen it too many times. And if this was the mission that killed him, then so be it. He would rather die running toward the fire than live haunted by the screams of children he couldn't save. He passed checkpoints with forged clearance, slept under trees with one eye open, ate nothing but dried nuts and river water. His body ached, but his purpose burned hotter than the sun overhead. Each mile brought him closer, not just to the hostages, but to the version of himself he had buried long ago, the boy who had no one coming to save him. The last village before the no man's land was abandoned. Doors swung open in the wind. Chickens clucked without owners. He entered a home where a fire still burned, but no soul remained. There, scrawled on a wall with charcoal, were the words, "They came in the night." He read it aloud. The silence. After felt like an omen. But he didn't flinch because this wasn't a mission. It was a reckoning, and reckoning always walks in alone. The sun rose without warmth, a pale disk hanging low over a land forgotten by maps. The further Traore drove, the less the terrain looked like Burkina Faso and more like the edge of the world. No roads, just trails burned into the earth by smugglers and ghosts. The trees stood like witnesses, their twisted branches holding secrets too heavy for words. He reached the canyon just after noon. It wasn't marked on any of the army's topographic charts, but an old nomad he bribed with water whispered of it. A ravine that cut deep into the flesh of the land, hidden from satellites and search parties. That's where they were keeping them, he said, eyes darting like a man who'd seen death too many times and lived to regret it. Traore stood at the edge, staring down into the darkness below. From up here, the world looked clean. The wind brushed over the surface, smooth as silk, hiding the horror festering beneath. He took his rifle, slung it over his shoulder, and began his descent. Boots skidding against loose rock and brittle soil. Every step felt like a confession. A return to a place inside him he had tried to forget. The ravine narrowed into a gorge, its walls high and sharp, cutting out the sky. The air grew colder. The smell of sweat, blood, and smoke hit him like a blow. He knew what it meant. People were down here. Alive, but only just. He crept through the passage like a shadow. There were voices, rough, angry, foreign tongues blending with local dialects. He recognized the accent. Not jihadists, not bandits, mercenaries, paid guns from across the sea, men who had no ideology, only contracts. These were worse than radicals. They didn't believe in anything. That made them impossible to bargain with. Behind a broken ledge, Traore found a vantage point. Below, in a clearing between jagged rock walls, stood 2 canvas tents and a makeshift cage fashioned from steel wire and wooden poles. Inside were the hostages, 6 children, 2 adults, faces smeared with dust, eyes too tired to cry. They didn't scream. Screaming was a luxury they'd already spent. A rage began to build in him, not loud, not reckless. It was cold, ancient, the kind that comes not from adrenaline but from memory. He thought of his sister Mariam. She had died in a camp. Like this, starved while the guards played cards and laughed. He had found her body curled beside a dying dog. Her wrist still wore the bracelet. He gave her the day he left for military school. He gripped the stone beneath him until his knuckles bled. Below, the guards laughed. One of them lit a cigarette. Another kicked the cage, yelling something about silence. One child flinched, another covered her ears, and then something else happened. One of the boys, maybe 9 or 10, stood up and faced the guard. Thin as a reed, eyes like flint, he didn't speak. He just stared, and in that stare, Traore saw defiance, a reminder that even in cages there can be fire. He whispered it then, under his breath, the phrase that had carried him through every battlefield, every failure, every betrayal. Even in darkness, we are not broken. It was more than words. It was truth carved from scars. He needed a plan. A frontal assault would get them all killed. He checked his gear, 2 mags, a combat knife, a smoke grenade, and a flare. Not enough, but he wasn't here for a war. He was here for a message. That the people of this land would not be buried quietly. Not again. He waited for nightfall. His stomach clawed for food. His muscles ached from holding still. But he didn't move. When the last sliver of sun disappeared, he slid down the rocks and vanished into the black dot. It happened fast. A thrown stone lured one of the guards into the dark. A blade across the throat silenced him. Another step, another shadow. One by one, they fell not from brute force but precision. Traore was a whisper in the wind, a memory of vengeance made. Flesh, but war is never silent. A gun fired. Too loud, too soon, a shot grazed his shoulder, spun him into the dirt. He rolled, fired back, 2 bursts, 1 man down. Then the flare. Red light flooded the gorge like blood, revealing everything. He saw the hostages flinch. Guards scrambling, yelling. He fired again, once, twice. Then something cracked. He looked down. Blood, not a graze, hole torn through the side of his abdomen. He fell to his knees, gasping. The world tilted, but he didn't let go. He crawled to the cage, key snatched from a dead man's belt. His fingers fumbled. The lock wouldn't turn. A girl sobbed behind him. A child clung to his leg. Then it clicked open. "Run," he rasped. They hesitated. "Run," and they did. Barefoot and afraid, but they ran. He slumped against the bars, smoke rising. The last mercenary screamed something and charged. Traore reached for his pistol. Empty. He closed his eyes and smiled. Then a gunshot echoed, but it wasn't his. The young boy had taken a rifle from a fallen guard. His arms shook, but he had fired. And the man fell. Traore looked at him, proud and broken. Then he passed out beneath. The stars, blood seeping into the earth, and even as the world slipped from his grasp, one truth echoed through him like a heartbeat. Even in darkness, we are not broken. The first thing he heard was breathing. Not his own, but others, quick, anxious, like wind rustling through leaves. Then came the dull murmur of voices, muffled through cloth. Pain surged next, a raw, biting kind that wrapped around his abdomen. Like fire, he opened his eyes slowly, and the world returned in fragments. A small clay room, the flicker of lantern light, the smell of alcohol, sweat, and smoke. Someone whispered his name. "Capitin, Capitaine Traore, you're alive." He tried to speak, but his throat felt like it was filled with sand. His lips cracked when he moved them. A young girl approached, carrying a damp cloth, Asada. He remembered her face, the fear, the strength in her eyes when she escaped. Now she looked different. Not unafraid, but unshaken. "You saved us," she whispered. The memories came crashing. Back to Canyon, the gunfire, the boy who fired the last shot. He wanted to sit up, to ask where they were, who had found them, but his body refused. So he let the pain wash over him, letting the silence answer. They had dragged him out. The children, the two women, even the boy, had somehow found a Tuareg. Patrolled 2 kilometers out, the same men Traore had once spared during a border conflict. They returned the debt without questions, carried him for hours across the dunes, held his hand when he lost consciousness again. He had slipped in and out of fevered dreams, tangled memories of war and childhood, of faces long buried and voices long silenced. Days passed in that desert clinic. He barely moved, but every time he opened his eyes, someone was there. Not doctors, not soldiers, just villagers. Strangers who brought tea and prayers. One woman sang to him in the mornings, an old lullaby he had not heard since his mother died. It broke him quietly each time, but he never asked her to stop. When the fever finally broke, and he could sit with help, they told him how the world reacted. The story had spread, leaked by the survivors who had made it to the regional capital. It was picked up by radio stations, whispered through mosques and marketplaces, shared in rebel hideouts and presidential offices. A soldier had gone alone into death's hands, uninvited, to rescue the forgotten, but the headlines didn't matter to him. It was the letters, dozens of them, folded into bags and hands, from mothers he'd never met, from boys who wanted to be like him, from elders who called him the son of the land. He couldn't read most of them without tears blurring the ink. They weren't writing to a hero. They were writing to hope. And yet, even as he healed, something inside him broke open. He had seen too much. The silence of leadership when it mattered. The bureaucratic shields that protected borders but not lives. The politics of pretending peace while people disappeared. This mission, his survival, was not a story of glory. It was an indictment of all that had failed. They came for him weeks later. A convoy of government officials, cameras in tow, medals in polished boxes. They wanted to pin something on his chest and parade him through the capital. But when the minister stepped forward, Traore didn't rise. He looked him in the eye, voice low, roughened by recovery. "I didn't do this for medals. I did it because you wouldn't." There was no applause, only silence. The officials left, a mix of discomfort and shame on their faces. He remained in that village for months, long after his wounds healed. built a new water line with the help of engineers from the army, raised funds for the children's school, planted sunflowers in front of it, Asada's favorite. She smiled the first time they bloomed, and it felt like the sun itself had bent toward them. Traore didn't return to command, not at first. He spent his nights under open skies, speaking to stars like old friends. He walked the edge of the canyon again, not to fight, but to remember. Every stone held a memory. Every shadow, a lesson. He carved their names into the side of the rock wall, those he had saved, and those he couldn't. When the time came to leave, the entire village walked with him to the road. No speeches, just hands on his shoulders. Children wrapped around his legs. Asada pressed a bracelet into his hand. It was made of colored thread and beads. It spelled one phrase in tiny, careful letters: "Even in darkness, we are not broken." He held it for a long time before tying it to his wrist. He wore it beneath his uniform, and from that day forward, every mission he led began with silence. Standing in a circle with his team, palms open to the sky, eyes closed, honoring not just the living but the truth they carried. That courage is not in firepower. It's in the decision to walk toward the fear, even alone. That hope isn't born from orders. It grows from sacrifice, and that even in the darkest, deepest corners of a forgotten war, the smallest act of resistance, saving one child, standing for one truth, can echo louder than bombs. He was home, but he did not feel whole. Ouagadougou welcomed him with open arms. Though Traore moved through the city like a ghost of himself, the streets had changed, or maybe he had. Vendors called out with cheerful voices, children chased motorcycles through alleyways, and radios played the same anthems of patriotism. But beneath the music, beneath the laughter and familiar faces, there was something else: expectation. People looked at him now, not just as a leader, but as something more. A symbol, a myth. The man who walked into fire and came back with innocence still intact. And though their reverence came with love, it weighed heavily on him. He had never set out to be anything more than a soldier who didn't look away. But now, every gaze carried a question: what will you do next? He spent his mornings at the rehabilitation center, shoulder-wrapped, stomach scarred. The pain was manageable, but the memories weren't. Sleep became a privilege. The canyon came back in flashes. The boy with the gun, the blood on his palms, the face of the mercenary just before the end. Not regret, not rage, just emptiness. That was the part that haunted him most, the absence of anything in the eyes of men who had turned cruelty into currency. One night, he sat alone in his apartment, lights off, the city humming faintly through the open window. On the table beside him sat the bracelet Asata had made. Its colors had faded slightly. The phrase was still there: even in darkness, we are not broken. He held it like a prayer, fingers trembling. A knock came at the door, sharp, urgent. He opened it to find a woman wrapped in a plain green shawl. Her face was tired, weathered, but her eyes held steel. She introduced herself as Halima. Her daughter, 12 years old, had been missing for 3 weeks, last seen near the eastern border. The army had filed a report, promised to look. But nothing had happened. I was told you listen, she said. He didn't answer. Just stepped aside and let her in. She told him the story. Her voice didn't waver. She had cried enough. There was only one thing left now: action. When she left, Traore sat for a long time with her words ringing in his ears. He knew what this was. Not just another case, it was a reckoning. The same silence that had surrounded the children in the canyon was swallowing others again. He could not let it grow. He called no one. Instead, he drove himself to the eastern outposts. The terrain was harsh, but he remembered every ridge, every whisper of wind. He found the village Halima had described. Met with elders, walked the riverbanks, slept on the same dirt as the people whose lives were measured in fear and waiting. The clues were few, but the silence was loud. Local officials refused to talk. There were rumors of an international trafficking, ring smuggling girls across the border, hidden in convoys disguised as aid. And worse, whispers that some officials were paid to look away, Traore didn't rage. He moved with quiet fury. He tracked a lead through a border town, posed as a courier, slipped into the underbelly of a false aid warehouse, and there, in a back room behind padlocked crates and blacked-out windows, he found 3 girls. One of them was Halima's daughter. They were too weak to speak. But they were alive. He carried them out one by one. The men responsible were arrested. No trial, no press. Traore made sure they vanished like the fear they fed on. There would be no mercy for those who traded children for coins. When Halima saw her daughter again, she collapsed in his arms. No words, just sobs that shook her entire body. He stood there, motionless, the girl in his arms, the mother's tears soaking through his uniform. Later that night, sitting alone, beside a dying fire, he repeated the words he had held close in the canyon, not aloud. Not to anyone. Even in darkness, we are not broken. And this time, he believed it more than ever, because survival wasn't the victory. It was returning to the fight when no one was watching, when no flags waved, when no medals gleamed, the quiet missions, the impossible choices, the moments no camera would ever see. They asked him later why he went alone again. He didn't answer, but if they had listened closely, if they had leaned into the silence, they might have heard the truth buried in his stillness. Because if I don't, who will? It rained the day he returned home for good. Not the kind of storm that forces people indoors, but the slow, steady kind, the one that makes everything softer. The clay roads glistened under the weight of memory. The trees stood motionless as if listening, and the air was thick with something unspoken. Traore walked alone, dressed not in uniform but in a simple white tunic. No guards, no convoy, no ceremony. Just a man with tired eyes returning to a place that had shaped him long before the medals and missions. The village had changed little. The same stone well where he used to drink as a child. The same tree under which his mother once hummed lullabies while pounding millet. Her grave still rested under that tree, now surrounded by wildflowers that grew without permission. He knelt beside it, laying down a folded cloth wrapped around a small wooden carving a sunflower. It had been made by Asada and gifted to him before he left the military for good. She had painted it herself, bright yellow, with a tiny smiley face in the middle. He told her once that sunflowers always turn toward the light. She reminded him, with the unflinching honesty only children possess, that light sometimes needed to turn toward them too. For a long while he said nothing, just placed his palm on the earth and breathed. He had stepped away from command, not in shame, nor in exhaustion, but in the realization that leadership didn't always wear stars. Sometimes it lived in building schools with bare hands, in teaching young boys how to plant instead of fight, in showing girls that their voices were not meant to be quiet. He had fought wars, crossed borders, bled in silence, but here, in this village, he began to understand something that had eluded him for years. That peace was not a prize. It was a daily decision. He spent his days working with farmers, repairing the broken roof of the school, teaching children how to read maps not of territory, but of their own futures. At night, he'd sit with the elders around small fires, listening, more than speaking. He never spoke of the missions, the bullets, or the blood. Only of what remained after all of it, the responsibility to protect what was still beautiful. Word spread quietly. Other villages sent letters. Some sent young men who wanted to learn. A few sent stories asking for help. Traore replied to everyone, not with promises but with honesty, that he could not save the world, but he could walk with those who dared to save themselves. One evening, a small boy named Moussa brought him a broken radio. It belonged to his father, who died in a mining accident. The boy had never heard it play. Traore sat with him beneath a tree, unscrewed the back, cleaned the wires, and spent 2 hours soldering with nothing but an old fire coil and patience. When the signal returned, a faint song came through, an old folk hymn, sung in Moor, about the river that carries sorrow and joy in the same current. The boy stared, eyes wide. "You fixed it," Traore smiled gently. "No, Moussa. We just reminded it how to listen." That night, as the village drifted to sleep, he sat beside the well and looked at the stars. The same stars he had once spoken to in the desert, the same ones that had witnessed his fear and his defiance. They looked no different. But something inside him had shifted. He knew that some stories end without fanfare, that some wounds never heal clean, that in this life the quiet victories are the ones that matter most. He touched the bracelet on his wrist, now faded, a few beads missing, the thread thin but still holding. The words barely legible, even in darkness. "We are not broken," he whispered it once more, not as a soldier, not as a savior, but as a man who had finally come to peace with all he could not fix. And then, as the rain began again, soft as a breath, he closed his eyes, not to forget, but to remember, in silence, where the real stories live.